Coming up on Need to Know, Assembly Majority Leader Joe Morelle stops by, and he's weighing in on the state of the White House, ethics reform in Albany, and the race for Rochester mayor. That's next. Also on the show, it's pivotal for healthy brain development, and it's a key weapon to help fight obesity in youth. But why aren't more kids in our region doing it? The state of play later on the show. And we're taking a break from the mayoral campaign trail and transitioning to the nature trail to learn about the person behind the politician. Stay with us. Need to Know starts right now. Hirings and firings in the White House, continued outrage over ethics reform or a lack thereof in Albany, and a race for mayor that's been making daily headlines as of late in Rochester. There's no shortage of political news to discuss this week, so we invited Assembly Majority Leader Democrat Joe Morelle to weigh in. He stopped by the WXXI studios earlier this week to do just that. Take a look. Assemblyman, you have been in politics, and I am not going to age you here, but for more than 3 decades, so we'll say that.
Sounds
so,
aged.
But I say all that to say you have been around and you understand the inner workings of politics. You have seen and you have experienced much, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I want to know, and I really want to get your perspective on the national political landscape right now. Would you say that we are in a good phase, a bad phase, or an ugly phase?
I'd say bad and ugly.
Why?
Not necessarily because, as a Democrat, I'm not crazy about some of the things that the Trump administration has proposed to do. But what troubles me is the sort of the nature of the discourse. It's gotten much more crude. It's gotten, there's no civility left in politics and in government. There's no reaching across the aisle. And even the use of facts or the questioning of truth, or someone who says something now in politics knowing it not to be true, but just sort of writes it off and says, yeah, but it's politics, that's what we do. I think the public, unfortunately, is getting the wrong idea of most of the people who are attracted to government and public service. The vast majority are good, honorable people. They want to do the right thing. And honestly, when you think about sometimes the philosophies between Democrats and Republicans, there is common ground and there is middle ground. And that's what we ought to be seeking, because, people often say, and I think it's right, that neither Democrats nor Republicans have, a monopoly on the truth. And working together and working across party lines usually does lead to better outcomes. We certainly see that in Albany. And Albany gets sort of mixed in with Washington. It's just all politics, nothing good happens. But with a Democratic Assembly and a Republican Senate, nothing can happen in Albany without bipartisanship. And it happens all the time, doesn't get written about very much. People tend to focus on those things that separate us rather than those things that we find common ground on. But in Washington now, and I honestly, I hate to say this, but I think the president deserves blame or credit for what happens in terms of the tone of the debate. And I see too many people now getting into politics who think just rough and tumble, say whatever you want, don't care about your person who you might see as an adversary. And it doesn't lead to good outcomes. My father often said, I'm old school, which is you try to do things the right way. You try to be honorable in what you do. It's something I try to live every day. It's hard sometimes, and you don't always get to be the way you want to be, but you really try to keep that as the sort of value. And I fear that that's going away in Washington. I see it in some degree in Albany as well. And I think that's troubling, because I don't want people to be attracted to sort of the I hate to say glamour, because I don't really know if it's glamour, but the notoriety and who are attracted to the sort of the fight and the how much attention you can get on social media, and the desire that I just want to be a celebrity. I can't imagine our founding fathers thinking of celebrity as what would attract people to public service. So I think all of us are rightly concerned and troubled by what's going on.
Well, let's focus. You mentioned Albany, so we'll kind of transition to state government and the direct impact on our region. Plenty to discuss there for sure. So some of the measures passed by the legislature this year, I'm just going to list a few: raising the age for criminal prosecution of children, legalization of Uber and Lyft, free college tuition for middle-class students to SUNY and CUNY schools, allowing medical marijuana to be prescribed for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, and a bill that gives cancer patients dealing with medical malpractice more time to sue. Those are a few of the things. What is one thing that I left off this list that you would say you were directly involved in that also has a direct impact on those in our region?
The flood recovery efforts. I worked with Senator Helming, and we fashioned a significant recovery relief bill, $45 million for people in our region who are affected by flooding. And that's both homeowners as well as small businesses, as well as the municipalities that are dealing with the after effects, and in some cases the continued impact of flooding along the entire Lake Ontario region all the way up to the St. Lawrence. I
would imagine that your constituents, you heard quite a great deal from them in regards to that in particular.
Yeah, certainly those. It's sort of interesting. This happened during the windstorm as well back in March, is that if you were affected, it was really a significant burden on you and your family. If you weren't, it seemed like almost, if you didn't have a loss of power or you weren't affected by the windstorm, after a couple of days you'd say, well, what's the big deal? It's sort of the same thing. If you're not in an area or a community that's flooded and dealing with the effects of the flooding, you might not realize the hardship that people are still dealing with, but it is significant. And the record rains have contributed significantly to it, as has, there's some dispute about how much the International Joint Commission and Plan 2014 contributed to this. It contributed the degree to which I think is still up to some debate.
Well, one thing that I'm going to look to the flip side here, a number of bills that were not passed in the legislative session. And I read a report that said while 84 bills were passed this year, more than 500 measures remain untouched. Right. So what does it take to get the legislature to act? And I'm asking this because was this an unusual year? Because you mentioned this bipartisan support that exists in Albany, and some may question that when they hear, my gosh, what happened and why were certain measures not dealt with?
Right. Well, there are about 12,000 bills introduced in the course of the two-year session. You know, one of my primary responsibilities is to try to help winnow that number and sort of identify what are those things that are real priorities, what are those things that have bipartisan and broad support, and which of those items can probably get the approval of the governor, because we have to go through that process. So,
any examples that you would give, that you would say, yes, this I pulled from here, and these are things that we looked at?
Things that we did not do?
Yes.
Oh, there's a number of things that we decided not to do, either because there wasn't broad support, or you're concerned that it isn't fully baked, that there will be unintended consequences, and you're going to want to think about that or reflect on it a little more before you act on it. So we have right now, when I go back in January, the active calendar in the Assembly will be 600 bills that are ready to be considered. Those have all gone through the committee process. They may not have made it out by June, but they're on the cusp of being considered. But sometimes you'll have bills that will pass the Assembly because Democrats support them and the Republicans in the Senate don't, and vice versa. So the real, sort of art of all this is trying to find, as I said, common ground on something that's really important to a broad cross-section of people around the state and that you can agree to.
So I want to ask one thing after the legislative session ended that I still read reports about ethics reform, and this question, why has there been no movement on this? And I know that after the ex-Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver crisis in 2015, you were quoted as saying in an article, ethics reform will happen, it will come to Albany. And we look 2 years later, why are we hearing from people that there's been no real movement, no momentum on this?
Well, actually, I think there was some significant momentum. Two things happened this year that will really, I think, be very meaningful. First is we passed final passage and the voters approved a constitutional amendment to forfeit pensions for anyone who breaks the law in the conduct of their official duties. So that's a brand new thing that was added to the Constitution. The second is we agreed with the Senate to have a new rule that relates to every member in the legislature, that prior to any outside income, you have to get the approval of the Legislative Ethics Commission, who will then research to make sure what you tell them you are doing as outside income doesn't violate any of the public officers laws provisions or anything else that would violate your ability or impede your ability to do your job. So it really is preventive in that whatever you're going to do from an economic point of view, you're going to have to get approval of legislative ethics committee before it happens. So that's really, in my mind, I think people want to see sometimes increased penalties. They want to see a whole host of things, but those are after the fact. What we really want to do is create an environment where the public is certain that the people who are making decisions on things that affect their life are doing so freely, doing so without the benefit of some outside income that they're not aware of. That's clearly what happened in the case of Speaker Silver. But some of the other reason that we haven't gotten an agreement is, I think fundamentally the Assembly Democrats, for instance, would like to limit outside income altogether. So say that you could have something like they have the model in Congress, or a number of dollars that you could you'd still have to make sure that they weren't in violation of your public oath, but you'd limit the outside income. The Senate rejects that idea. The Senate would like to do some other things that the Assembly's rejected. So I think sometimes it's just philosophical differences. And I also think this, that if someone goes to their job, whether they're selling cars or whether they're passing legislation or whether they're doing any other kind of work, if in their heart they have a desire to cheat the system, it's awfully hard to get to identify those people in advance. We're working very hard to make sure that we can identify and eliminate conflicts before they happen. But I think at the end of the day, human nature being what it is, it's impossible to consider every situation
when you say you're
before
close,
it happens.
I guess how close? I mean, what does that mean in the grand scheme of things when you're close to identifying some of those things?
Well, in terms of conflicts,
yeah.
Well, because now the Legislative Ethics Commission would have you write and say, these are the things that I'm involved in. I sell real estate. I teach at a university one course. I do this as an attorney. Well, they're going to ask to describe what kind of activities you do. In some cases, like with attorneys, we require them to disclose who their clients are. So there's a lot more disclosure in advance to try to eliminate potential conflicts before they happen.
Before I let you go, I do have to ask, we've got a race for mayor in the works right now this year. We've got 5 candidates. I've had all 5 on the program, had an opportunity to hear from them. As you've observed the varied campaigns and the platforms, and you follow along in the news of the day in relation to the race, what are your thoughts?
Well, I always want the city and the county and local communities to elect people who share the values of the public, that are going to work hard, they're going to have the utmost in integrity, that you can rely on in the moment of crisis to make sound decisions, and that will attract good quality people to an administration. So I know the various candidates are out there talking about their views. It's good for Rochester that there's a competitive race. As a former county chairman, I'm glad I'm not there anymore, so I don't have to help referee this. I can just watch and read the newspaper and watch on TV and listen on the radio. But I think it's good for the community, for people with different viewpoints to express their views, and people get an idea on who they want to lead in what is going to be a very difficult series of years, because support for the federal government is declining. States and the state of New York is going to be challenged economically over the next several years, and this region faces real challenges. So whoever is chosen to lead needs to be the person that the public has the utmost faith can get the job done.
Any one candidate, in your opinion, you believe is better suited to lead?
Yeah, I'm sort of staying out of mayoral politics and watching. They're all friends. I've known each of them in different capacities, and obviously wish them well, and hope. As I have always said, I trust the voters ultimately do the right thing.
Assembly Majority Leader Joe Morelle, it has been too long. I said this before we got started with the interview. I think 4 years. I hope to see you again very soon.
We will make a point of doing that. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
For more coverage of state politics, be sure to tune in to WXXI's Capitol Bureau Chief Karen DeWitt on WXXI Radio and online at WXXInews.org. Just click on the Capitol Bureau link for Karen's latest reports. Here's a stat that may surprise you. Only 12% of youth in Greater Rochester and the Finger Lakes are getting daily physical activity. I'm talking 60 minutes a day of active time. That's one of the stats released in a recent report by the Aspen Institute. The findings are being used by the Wilson Foundation and the Rochester Area Community Foundation to improve access to sports, among other things, for area kids. So why is this important? And why do you need to know about it? Joining me in the studio to explain is Hank Rubin, Vice President of Community Programs for the Rochester Area Community Foundation. Chad C.J. Thomas, a youth athlete and freshman at East High School. Iris Zimmerman, a former Olympian and co-owner of Rochester Fencing Club. And Tony Jordan, President of Rochester Youth Sports Foundation. Welcome to all of you. I appreciate it. So I want to start with why. Why are so few kids in our region getting the physical activity activity that they need, the activity recommended by obesity experts, recommended by the CDC. Why is this happening? And I'll give this to you first, Hank.
Well, I'll start with what the report showed and what even this morning's Democrat and Chronicle showed. The huge distraction of technology for kids who would much rather be sitting in front of the technology instead of running around outside. The absence of parental engagement on the sports activities. 81% of all the parents that were interviewed on this said that they would like to see their kids more engaged in recreational and sports activities. But as you said, only 12 or 13% of the kids actually do it on a daily basis. The Aspen report, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, found such things as the absence of facilities and resources that are within walking range, within short driving range, the absence of transportation resources to get to some of these, and the absence of coaches and the absence of more. So it's really a concerted opportunity for a lot of us in the community to start thinking about how to put our heads together to not just create resources and opportunities for recreation and sports for kids, but to sort of elevate that as a priority, as something that's cool and fun and needs to happen among kids.
Well, this was an extensive report. 40 findings that incorporated the viewpoints of more than 1,000 adults and young people in the region, in addition to a task force of more than 3,000 people, 3 dozen people. The thing that I liked about it, incorporating young people such as you, CJ, and you were featured in the State of Play report. Yes. You are what we would call, right, a triple threat. Yes. You are involved in football, basketball, and baseball. You are also an honor student. And I want to know, tell me about some of the challenges that you encountered, your family encountered, when you wanted to get involved in organized sports in your neighborhood.
We were searching for a good program that had good coaches and everybody wasn't fighting for the same position. That was pretty much hard to find for baseball, especially because I tried T-ball in the city, but we never even had a game. I mean, it was just so unorganized in the city. Football, kids fighting for the same positions, coaches yelling at me. I wanted to quit football at one point, but I got back into it once I went to the suburbs because everybody's not trying to get the same position. The coaches are nicer, everybody's hardworking, and again, that's just.
So the solution that your family found was to go to the suburbs to get involved in those different leagues.
Yes.
So I want to follow up on that because, and you mentioned this too, Hank, accessibility and accessibility and all that word entails, right? Based on some of the findings in this report. Iris and Tony, what would you point to in terms of the accessibility issues? What are they? But what are some opportunities that we have available to kind of fill that gap?
We don't have enough time. I think Tony can speak to a lot of it, but you know, I'm a for-profit business owning the Rochester Fencing Club, and I've started a non-profit arm of it, trying to get into the city. And it's not just accessibility. I've even offered getting a grant from the Greater Rochester Health Foundation, going into a city school and saying, hey, we'll offer fencing for free. I don't know who to talk to. No one gets back to me. It's not just accessibility, but it's also there are communication gaps and barriers of who to talk to, who's the point person. And so you really, if you're going to do that, you do what Tony does, is you dedicate everything to that nonprofit because you have to be on top of it the whole time.
Yeah, and I agree. I think one of the big things is the education that our community has around the value of sports, so that people understand that it's not just a recreational type thing. It's not just for someone who is very talented. Sports is for everyone, play is for everyone, and it's a matter of life and death to a certain extent when you're talking about obesity and you're talking about social and emotional health of our youth, because we found that kids who play do something after school, have better academic outcomes, have better health outcomes. So I think we have to re-educate our community, and then the communication barrier is huge. You know, getting people together, like-minded, that can connect the parents, the children, and the coaches in these organizations. So we do have a lot of things that we have the opportunity to work on now.
I just wanted to add that there was a twofold problem. One is the parents aren't active. I mean, how many of us don't want to, we talked about not eating our vegetables. The parents aren't going to the gym or being active. So the kids are role modeling from the parents. The second thing is, and I want to just say that again, is that sports is seen as a stepchild. Like, everyone wants to pump money into STEM. Everyone thinks that it's all about science. But you can't have that. People are active people, and we learn better if we're active.
the research in terms of brain development and for young people getting involved in sports. I mean, it is immense, and I want to talk about that because of our stakeholders who are watching, right? The stakeholders in this community, and also the viewers tuning in who may say, well, my kids are involved in sports, like we're fine. And I want to speak to those people in particular because there are benefits for those in Greater Rochester and the Finger Lakes in increasing the number of young people who are actively involved, increasing access, ensuring that they get more physical activity. Hank, talk about some of the benefits and talk about some of the recommendations in this report to kind of help facilitate kind of revitalizing youth activities.
The first recommendation is that, as both Tony and Iris said here, making sure that we elevate this as a priority, making this part of a larger conversation, engaging people who would not ordinarily even be part of this conversation in realizing the significance of healthy recreational options for kids, encouragement of engagement in those healthy recreational and sports options, that those are not discretionary in terms of we don't need those as much as we need good education, we don't need those as much as we need good health. These are things that contribute to the access and the capacity of kids to grow up and do good education, participate and receive good education. They help us ensure that kids are going to grow up healthy. They reduce our health costs. They increase the impact of our educational opportunities. And so it's sports and recreations as resources and supports for so much more that we're trying to work on in Rochester to help ensure that the kids in the Rochester and Finger Lakes region grow up healthy, promoted for full access to all the resources they want to be able to access, well-educated, healthy, and so forth. You know, there's a wonderful, this is the report. Yeah. And
we'll have a link to that for our viewers too.
Very good, because we're happy to distribute this to as many people, and it's available online. There's a wonderful set in the back of the report of what they call, instead of recommendations, they call them ideas. And they have everything to do with engaging civic leaders more effectively, building coalitions across youth resources, building transportation resources that don't yet exist, trainings for coaches.
And I'm going to jump in here with you because I want to ask you, CJ, something that I appreciated about this report was they said far too often we hear from the adults who are organizing in youth sports, and we don't hear from the young people who are involved in them in terms of what they want to see. So we've got this list of ideas. What do you want to see happen, or what are you hoping will happen when it comes to youth sports for your siblings, for your classmates, so that they have that access and more availability to them?
I just want everybody, I want them to know that if they try to use sport, they will be happy and that they will succeed in whatever they're doing. So I don't want everybody just going there just trying to do something that they really don't want to do. I want them to be happy and like succeed out of what they really want to do.
How do you think it's benefited you being involved in the three sports?
I think it's benefited me a lot because I've known a lot of kids who just go to the rec center and play basketball. They have the talent, but then they get caught up in the streets because they're too lazy to do it and they're not being pushed by their parents to do anything. They just want to sit on the streets and do things that are illegal and things.
You know, Helene, it's interesting. That report was written by somebody who's also a journalist like you. And one of the recommendations or ideas in here includes just what you just did, that we need, if we're going to be really effective at this, we need not to presume that those of us who are, let me say, over 30 in this room, have the answers to what the kids want and need and will participate in enthusiastically in terms of rec and sports. We have to go to the kids and learn from them what's going to light their fires and engage them in these activities.
We've got less than a minute. I just want to say how I'm interested. Less than a minute, sorry. How has the community responded? How, so far, this report was released in June. What's happening? What are we hearing?
I think for us who are out there in that youth sports space, we're very, very excited to see what things are coming up.
Yeah, and I think what it's doing is it's putting it on the forefront. So this has given us the opportunity to continue the conversation with folks, like Hank said, that don't typically pay attention to sports or take it serious as a part of the healthy opportunities for youth to grow up and be productive citizens. So this has given us a chance to get their attention, get parents' attention, and then work with young people to see what their interests are.
And we have to. I'm so sorry, Hank. We got to close. But a special thank you to all of you for being here. Obviously, lots more that we can discuss. But two do be sure to check out the report. It is available online for you by the Aspen Institute. Great practical suggestions that can be used. Go to RACF/reports to download State of Play. And now we are back with the person behind the politician. This summer, we invited all the candidates in the race for Rochester mayor to be a part of this special segment on Need to Know. The goal? To get to know the candidates as everyday people rather than politicians. How? By joining them as they participate in one of their favorite pastimes. First up was Democrat Rachel Barnhart, followed by Green Party candidate Alex White. And tonight, it's independent candidate Lori Thomas.
Oh, wow, look at you. When some people describe their happy place, they might say there's no place like home. But Lori Thomas is more likely to say there's no place like the great outdoors.
Should have brought my other lenses. I'm gonna have to come back.
Especially when she's got her camera in hand.
I just love being around nature. You know, we're just deluged with negativity every single day, and it's the ability to release the negative energy that's built up and soak up the positive energy of nature. And just when I feel it, I like to capture it in a picture.
The candidate for mayor says she's been armed with a camera as far back as she can remember. Photography is a hobby she picked up to connect with her mother, an artist in her own right.
When I was a little girl, my mother used to have this beautiful floral pattern wallpaper, and it was just one of our bonding things. I'd go into her room and climb into bed and say, "Mom, draw me a picture of one of the flowers." And you know, she was a single parent, worked a couple of jobs, and she'd quickly draw out one of the patterns on the wallpaper and say, "Here, now go away, let me sleep." And I would like treasure that, but I could never recreate it. And so photography was a way of me bonding with my mom's artistic talent.
While Thomas says documenting her travels around the globe give her an appreciation for life, it's her photographs in and of nature that give her perspective on the meaning of life.
I just love the beauty of nature, and I think that we're so afraid of death that we don't look at it for as beautiful as it is. And so that's how my photography kind of focuses on those things that have died and give us life.
Oh, hey. From roots and fallen bark to dead tree limbs and leaves, Thomas has a knack for creating images out of scenes in nature others would likely walk right past.
A pile.
Yeah.
Just a pile.
The mayoral candidate's home is like a gallery of sorts. Framed photos of some of her most prized images line the walls. It's her way of staying connected to the things that matter in life. And they serve as a reminder of just how far her craft has come.
When I first started, I took a lot of pictures of poo. Just poo. Just different kinds of scat. So, I mean, if you can see the beauty in poo, you can see the beauty in anything, you know, and that's kind of what I'd like to bring to people, that everything has a beauty to it if you just understand why it exists.
Lori Thomas has found a happy place indeed, capturing beauty and a touch of humor in the natural things in life.
And that wraps up another edition of Need to Know, Rochester's News Magazine. Thank you for joining me.